Rap Radio. Raw and uncut.
Cubo, and welcome to Chicano Rap Radio. I'm your homie Snipes holding it down, and today we're going to switch things up a little bit as we head into the second year of Chicano Rap Radio. We've made a conscious decision to cover as much as we can in regards to Chicano culture and not just focus on the music. Although music will be a big part of who we are, we also want to highlight a lot of individuals who are in the Chicano community and are contributing to the conversation, are contributing to the culture in their unique way. Today is the first of many interviews, and I'm really excited to welcome Oscar Magallanes, also known as NiMexica. So without further ado, let's welcome him to the show. How you doing, Oscar? How's your day going?
Pretty good. How about yourself? You doing good?
It's going well. It's going well. I'm really excited that we're able to kick this off, and I think you're the perfect person to start this new evolution of Chicano Rap Radio, because you are very much in tune with the Chicano community and Chicano culture. But before we get into all of that, I want to get to know you a little bit better. So tell me a little bit about yourself. How it is that you got started in the arts, some of your upbringings, and some of your influences that led you to where you are today.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you very much for having me. I'm really honored to kind of be the first in this branch of this kind of broader conversation around Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx culture. But yeah, a little bit about myself. I've been an artist for quite a while. Like they say, I never really stopped drawing since I was a child. I grew up in San Gabriel Valley, what's called the decade of death, right? Like in the 80s, 90s. Got to witness a lot of violence, the dark side of what happened with, that entire time period with, gang warfare, but also things that the government were complicit in, the flooding of the streets with crack cocaine, everything that was going on. Really heavy-handed criminalization of the community, which goes on to this day. I grew up around all of that, but at the same time, some of my earliest memories are very much of my community, these beautiful aspects of it, the car clubs, really, the lowriding, these things that I thought really kind of helped define who I was. Some of the first influences, or really the first artwork that I was exposed to, were murals around the community, murals that went up in the 70s, really reflecting kind of this reinvention of who we are, right? This
Mhm.
identifying as Chicanos, taking it upon ourselves to define who we are and what we're proud of, which again had some of that backlash with the criminalization of it.
Wait,
Um,
Thinking back of your childhood, when do you think was like the first experience that you can remember of you maybe being self-aware of who you are and your place in the community? I mean, we all grew up as just being little kids running around and doing what kids do, but at some point you realize, oh, hey, I'm different, or I'm being treated different because of this.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that because of the violence, my parents pulled my sisters out of public school and put them into a private school, and that's where the friction started. Like before that, we were all normal. We're all from the community. We're the normalization of we didn't know we were poor, right? Like, and that's again this capitalist system, this hyper individualism. But really, for me, it was being placed amongst these uppity like Hispanos, or like second, third generation who were just better off than we were. And that was
How
where
old were
the
you? How old were
oh
you?
well, you know what, I went in from first. I went to a private school from first through eighth, and it was a Catholic school, and I had so many issues in this school from the very beginning, where we were told we can't speak Spanish. I mean, just like look at it at the news. When you look at the education system, really, what did that do to people have who are leaning much more towards indigenous, or really like this non-Western way of thinking, right? And so we weren't allowed to speak Spanish. And then all the kids pretty quickly, like second, third grade, already started picking on me. I was the one that I was like the poor Mexican in the school. And it was really interesting to see, like every point of friction, like from my shoes to what I was eating, like all these things were really looked down upon. And by the time I was in sixth grade, I grew. I'm 6'1", and at that point it flipped, where then I was the one that started defending the kids that were getting picked on, and so I got into a lot of fights when I was younger. By the time I was 15 years old, I was kicked out of school.
Why do you think that was? Like at what point did you become, the protector of other people maybe going through a similar experience that you went through?
Well, that's exactly what it was. I knew what it felt like to be picked on, and
Mhm.
and to me, I don't know what it was. Within my family, my father was always like this tough guy, a union worker. I mean, labor. He worked doing a lot of different things, but he didn't put up with things, and he was kind of like this man's man kind of person, like literally fighting on the picket line sometimes. And I think I got that. There's within the culture there is this like really macho kind of way of doing things, but there's also a good sense of like protecting your community and protecting people that like we have a different sense of justice. Also, this idea of things that are fair. And when somebody gets picked on, to me, it doesn't matter who you are. Like I don't. It doesn't matter if I know you or not. It's not right. And I've seen people step in, and I'm sure you've seen it too. Like where we step in, where um, it's just there's something that's going on, and for me, that's pretty much been my entire life experience to
Now,
this day.
you experienced some of these things from your peers. What were there any instances of institutionalized racism at the school that you went to where you maybe experienced it from others?
Every single point of contact of my like Mexicanness or like me being a Chicano, like all of that, there was friction. There was never a time that it wasn't. From the books that we were reading, the histories that were being denied us, everything. And by the time I was, I don't know, probably like 10 years old, I already was an avid reader because not that I was naturally an avid reader. And that's another thing, right? That I had a learning disability that was never diagnosed because everybody just assumed I was like a dumb Mexican or something. But I was reading because I realized that was empowering. I was learning from another script. I was teaching myself history that was much more aligned to my worldview,
You're
rather than
running your own curriculum.
I completely was, and it's not completely altruistic. I mean, I loved calling out the teachers. I mean, they were a sense of authority, and I started questioning that from since I was very young, and it was because it didn't fit what I was being taught, did not fit at all my worldview, and
Right.
so that's where this rebelliousness came from. But then it also becomes self-destructive because you don't have an outlet.
Hmm.
And so, like I was saying, I was kicked out of school by the time I was 15. And I owe a lot to this woman, Nancy Moore, who was the assistant superintendent of the district, who sat in at my expulsion hearing. And she got me back into school within a couple months. And she really looked after me. Um, but it's really sad, though, because it got to that point before somebody would step in and really say, okay, what is it that you need? Like, what are these points of friction? What is the issue here? And she did that with a lot of people, and so she was able to get me into this, well, get me into some art classes, which is
Hmm.
what I always wanted to do. And from there, I got into Ryman Arts, which is a program that's still on, and I recommend anybody who's in high school, anybody who's looking into the arts to look into it. Um, and they're the first ones that told me that I could. They introduced me to professional artists, and it was the
Hmm.
first time that I heard somebody say you could be a professional artist. And so that's kind of where everything started.
So you talk about, someone stepping in and kind of helping you before it was too late. There's so many people, in the Chicano community that don't have someone to step in for them, that don't have someone to save them before it's too late, and you're talking about being, in an expulsion hearing. Now, were you looking at expulsion because of the trouble you were getting into, just because of, the institutionalized racism, or was there some kind of like street, like were you involved in the gang life growing up? Because I imagine growing up where you grew up, it was prevalent.
I grew up in the barrio of Azusa, but I wasn't involved with that, and that was the thing is that, but there, but anybody who grows up in the neighborhood knows that somehow you're navigating this, right? Like especially as a young male, like somehow you have to navigate it because either you're getting punked or you're like you somehow have to deal with it. And my most of my family, like uncles and cousins, they weren't from the neighborhood; they were from a different city, so there was this navigation that had to happen. But you couldn't completely be separate from it. And this institutional racism is part of it. Like, we wouldn't have gangs if it wasn't for institutional racism.
Right.
If it
Right.
wasn't from, like, you look at the beginnings of gangs, like, these are issues that had to do with neglect in our communities, or
Hmm.
our communities literally being raided by the military, like the Zutsu riots,
Hmm.
all of these things, and the protection, all these different things that had to happen for us to get to the point where we had street gangs, and that level of
Yeah.
violence was from other violence that was already inflicted on us.
Yeah.
From, and we could go back to like the war, right? The Mexican American War, which is never really talked about, in which is insane to me, where we have this occupied land, and this isn't even like this. It wasn't that long ago, right? Like, if we wanted to talk about, like, Israel and Palestine, but we can't have a conversation about, the Mexican American War. I mean, that's institutional racism right here. Like, that's
Right.
erasure of history. So all
Yeah,
of
it's
these
not
things come.
convenient to talk about it.
It's definitely not, especially with so many Mexicans in Southern
Right.
California or the
You don't want to
Southwest, right?
radicalize everybody.
And it's not even radical, right? Like, this is just history.
True.
But
Right.
if we want to talk about it, we had to adopt this identity that's seen as radical, when we're
Yeah.
just trying to talk about the truth. And we look at what's going on politically, like in different states, where they're trying to make it illegal to talk about these things, right?
Hmm.
Like, we can't
Yeah.
be critical of Western culture, which really is, another way of saying that we can't speak these histories, these
And,
alternative
and
histories.
and, I just wanted to, the reason why I wanted your point of view on that is because, you seem like a very well-rounded individual, very, very well read. You were exposed to a lot of things that, should have led to bigger and better opportunities, but yet somehow, because of institutionalized racism, you were still facing an expulsion. It's not like you were out there gang banging and looking for trouble, but yet you couldn't escape the fact that you are who you are in regards to your skin color, or your origins, or where you grew up. I mean, even though went to a private school, yet you still had all these other opportunities that were kind of keeping you down. And it sounds to me like art came into your life at some point and pointed you in a different direction. How is it that you got into the art?
Um, well, that's the thing. Like I mentioned, Ryman Arts, they're the first ones that allowed me to exhibit my work when I was 15 years old. Over at the time we were at USC, the program was held there. Uh, Actually, was it you? No, we were allowed to show there, but we were actually, the classes were held on campus at Otis back when it was at MacArthur Park.
Hmm.
So every week I would go down to LA and take classes out there on the weekend and these were traditional art classes. So that was the first time that I really saw myself as, okay, I'm an artist. I exhibited my work. 15 years old.
Right.
That's when you're thinking, okay, I can do this, right?
Hmm.
You're kind of forming your sense of self. But it took such a long time to undo the damage that the institutions did, right? Like the police, teachers, administrators, all of those things, just to get to the point where I wasn't self-destructive. And that was must have been in my 20s, where I sat there and I realized I'm sabotaging my relationships, with everybody that I love. And it was a punishment. And we also, and I've had, my partner works in the mental health field. I have conversations about not not or even my friends, right, that have gone through other institutions, uh that it isn't imposter syndrome. It's survivor's guilt that gets us, right? Where we always feel that we've left somebody behind. We always feel that when we do something we might not deserve it, or what did we do where that time that we invested in ourselves could have been invested in the community or helping others, right? And that's a difficult thing to navigate. And so it was in my 20s where I really had to break myself down and think, okay, what are these things that I'm doing? Like the things that I've done to myself, that I'm replaying in my head, that I'm doing to myself 1,000 times, right?
Hmm.
The anger that I was holding wasn't that somebody did something to me, it's that I let them do it to me, and I
Hmm.
continue to replay that in my head. And that's
Right.
one of the
Right.
most important things, is that, and I don't know how much of that we carry in, like with a new generation of Chicanos, but it could be very self-destructive until we're able to recognize these things, where that anger comes from, and to be able to get rid of it. And it took a long time to do that. And so I worked as a graphic designer up until, I don't know, maybe 2007, I think, is when that's how I was making a living, and I decided I'm going to do art full time.
Right.
And I had a lot of friends at that point that I had, um, peers that were doing it. So it was kind of normalized that we actually could make a living as artists.
Right.
Um,
Now, did you grow up? I know you had these experiences, in school, from the time, from first grade, and I imagine to middle school or even high school. But did you draw, or were you in art the whole time,
I
or
was
was
always
it kind
drawing.
of on and off?
I was always drawing,
Mm,
and I would always mimic these things that I would see from the murals, the old English that I would see, the placazos,
mm,
all these things is really what I was drawing, and tattoos. Like I would always like my uncle's tattoos. Like that was the style, like Teen Angels magazines, which were
right. I
always
remember.
confiscated. We like the teachers would always take these away, or even my parents, right? Because they were trying to keep me away from that culture, and that's part of what I really focus on recently is the aesthetics of things, right? Like how do we
Hmm.
criminalize these things, or how are
Right.
these things criminalized, right? Where we were
Right.
trying to create a sense of ourselves, and then it then becomes associated with just violence.
Well, and right now that you mentioned that, it makes me think of your thesis, that you wrote for your master's program. I want to get into that, and because obviously I've been staring at this beautiful truck behind you, for the last 10-15 minutes. I want to get into that a little bit more, but let's take a quick little break, and we'll be right back. You're listening to Chicano Rap Radio, raw and uncut.
Hit us up at 805-395-6595 for your special requests, dedications, and shout-outs. Chicano Rap Radio, raw and uncut.
Welcome back to Chicano Rap Radio. We've been having a very good conversation with Oscar Magallanes, aka NiMexica. We've been talking about his experience growing up. We've been talking about how he got into the art, how the art in many ways, helped kind of save his future, his and in your words, self-destructive. Future, and it led you to a more positive, more uplifting, more empowering, it turned you into a more empowering person. And you were talking about how, the criminalization of aesthetics. And so for some of us that maybe aren't as well read as you, tell us a little bit more about your thesis statement that you recently wrote for your master's program at UC San Diego. And also, if we can, let's get into that beautiful truck behind you. Why is that picture behind you, and what does it represent?
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, let me touch on this whole educational part of it, and really this has to do with institutions, right? And when we talk about institutions, it's like state prisons, right? And those are a state institution, right? And so the education system, like the UCs, like UCLA or UCSD, like San Diego, those are state institutions too, right? And so when we think about those as being part of the same system, then we can see like, oh, why do we have these outcomes, right? How come so many Black and brown youth are in prisons, right? And so you have the conversation within higher education. Why are there so few Black and brown people in the education system, right? In these institutions. And so if you don't take into account the other state institutions, then you're not gonna be able to answer those questions, right? And so for me, I didn't have a chance to go into higher education since I was young, again, because of, you know, lack of access. And so, I mean, I was literally told that I would never get into UCSD. And just recently, last like a month ago, I finished up my MFA at UCSD, and it was my partner who helped me go back to school. And I had already given up. I was doing my thing. I was exhibiting, and I started exhibiting since pretty actively since maybe 2005.
And for some of us that don't know what MFA is, what is that?
A Master's of Fine Art. So it's a graduate degree.
Congratulations.
And when it comes, thank you. And when it comes to art, that's a terminal degree because there isn't a doctorate in it. That's as far as you're going to go unless you want to go into the history part of it,
Mhm.
which I don't want to deal with that. But so yeah, so I'm pretty much done with school. But the reason I went back to school was because I wanted to be more competitive because I could see the art world becoming very elitist. I mean, not that it wasn't before, but the issues started to be that there's a lot of talent out there, very talented people, and I think you probably know that that talent and skills doesn't necessarily equal success, right? And so there's all these other mechanisms in place to privilege someone else, right? And they might not be as talented, but they just have access to resources or whatever it is,
Right.
right?
Right.
Or they're less offensive, whatever it is. Maybe the artwork was less political, so some abstract work, is going to be promoted by a brown person before political artwork is.
Right.
And we've seen things change, recently because of George Floyd and everything else that's gone on. So there's these conversations going on within these institutions where they're actually questioning, okay, what is our role in this? And to me, it was always like, okay, I want to be more competitive. I want to be in the room. I want to have this conversation. And it was really my partner who convinced me to go back to school. So I went back to UCLA. Luckily, I got in because I already had a long track record of being an artist. And it was difficult. It was extremely difficult to be in an institution that's not made for you, right?
And your art, you've had commercial, like I would say on the bigger level, right? I mean, you're not just like a local guy. I mean, you've had some commercial, artwork exhibited or recognized. I mean, and I think most people might know you for what you did with Mayans, right?
Yeah.
As far
Or
as
they'll know the work, but they won't know it's me. So yeah, I
yeah,
did the
now
the
they know.
first. Yeah, so I did the first work, and these are the things that we have to think about also, right? Politically, if I'm, Chicano and FX comes to me and says, "Hey, I want you to do this," I really have to think about it. Who do I want to work with, right? Like with these corporations, like I would never do something for certain shoe companies or whatever, right? I don't care how,
How
people are
much they pay.
promoting it. Yeah, that's because I just don't. I see it as being detrimental to the community,
So
especially
why was the
knowing
Mayans Motorcycle Club show
that to me
different?
was important because of the casting. Like we had a lot of Rasa in there. Like there's a lot of people that I think should be supported, and to me that's a big thing is to support something that's bigger like this, because these things become markers for, oh, should we support another show, right? Like these are the forerunners for the shows, and there was others, where to me the Mexicanos had to look bad on SOA, on the Sons of Anarchy before they could get their own show, right?
Hmm.
And to me, it was important to support, a lot of the people that are part of this project, and that's why I did it. And I'm proud of the work that I did for them, and again to support. Um, but there's that work, and at this point, I've done, I don't know, over 150 art shows. I'm in some institutions as far as private collections with some museums, and I've exhibited my work all the way up to Chicago, and I work with an art collective, and we've done murals from Oaxaca up right now. Currently working up north on one at Cal State Stanislaus. So yeah, I mean, stay busy, do a lot of work.
What's the mission of the art collective? I mean, why an art collective versus staying individual?
Well, we have our individual practices, but I guess that's part of the conversation when it comes to education too, right? We go to school to be more competitive, but we're still at the end of the day we're Latinos or Mexicanos or Chicanos, and so what we're gonna do when we get out of there, right? And while I'm in there, I see that a lot of the Chicanos and Latinos are having a hard time, and they would call it microaggressions, right? But really, it's systemic racism.
Hmm.
The narrative that we're being told when it comes to the trajectory of art, while we were at UCLA, and this is mandatory, like every student has to take a year of this history. We're being told that it was basically centered around these white males, and that's really not the way it went. Mexicans were extremely, extremely influential and important when it comes to the history, like in the early part of after the Mexican Revolution, um, and you could find this information anywhere,
And you're
like,
talking about
and
art in
this is
general,
art, like, and this isn't just like visual art, like this isn't just painting, this is theater, this is performance, this is
the arts.
just the world went to Mexico to study art and to see what was happening because it was a revolution that happened.
Well, and I think going back to the Spanish invasion, of Tenochtitlan, you talk about the craftsmen that were there already. I mean, you look at some of these sculptures that still exist today. Like the Aztec calendar, the Sunstone, right? I mean, that took. It wasn't just done by a novice. It was someone who perfected their skill, who understood, a lot of different concepts to be able to do something so beautiful that still exists today, and other people have gone and copied it. So I mean, I think that we do have a rich culture of being, of being producers of art. You had, the Spanish, the Aztec poets, you had the sculptors. I mean, you just have so much history going back even before, pre-Columbian times, where you can point at and say, look, we've been part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I don't see that any different than the truck behind me. Like and again, like it's collaborative. Like that, the Sunstone wasn't done on its own. Like the Noche wasn't built by one person. There wasn't one
Right.
architect. Like there wasn't an individual view, and these
Right.
were things that weren't separate from the daily life. They were actually done with such care and skill to honor the daily life. Right. The setting sun and the rising sun, like all these things were part of the artwork. Like these were part of the way that they conceived work, not I'm just going to hang something on my wall to be decorative.
Right.
Like these were things to it was a very different way of seeing art. And that's part of the conversation that I had while I was doing my MFA, was to talk about a different way of seeing art, right? And that low
Mm-hmm.
writing to me was a high form of audio art, right? Like that
Yeah.
was like to
Right.
me that was the highest form of audio art, where it was something that you used, like you wrote in, it would transform you, like it was the object by which you would become the lowrider, right? Like you were a lowrider when you would have this car, and
Right.
and to me it was having a conversation where within the context of a lowrider, there's nothing radical about it. It's a classic, 51 Chevy pickup, um, which I airbagged. But there's a whole nother conversation when it comes to like the lowrider community about that, right? Like that versus hydraulics, and there's this
Yeah.
whole other thing. But
Yeah. Yeah.
to me, it wasn't about presenting it to the lowrider community. It was about putting it into the gallery that traditionally only held artwork through that was being observed through a Western lens, right? Like through like
Right.
a European way of looking at art that we've been taught to look at art through. And to me, it was okay. Let's have this conversation of what is this object, and why is this worthy of being in a gallery, and how we
Mm-hmm.
should look back at art history the way it's been written and include this within that conversation. Where did this come from? Like
And
there's a
you,
hole there in that history, right?
right, right, right. And you built this truck as part of your thesis, right? For
Mm-hmm.
your master's program. Now, your thesis was the criminalization of aesthetics. Okay, can you explain that to me a little bit more?
Yeah, and that's the flip side of it, right? Like where these objects were something we're really proud of, right? Like in Azusa, we had the Azusa Car Club, and watching them go down the street, like 20 bombas and lowriders and all 18 switches. To me, that was something that really inspired a lot of pride in me. On the flip side, you could be cruising and literally, there's still laws on the books, making lowriding and cruising illegal. And to me,
Mhm.
that's the criminalization of aesthetics, right? And that goes back to like colonial times where it's like, oh, you're indigenous, like this is wrong, right? Like this is the othering of it. And so then we have to dress a certain way, we have to carry ourselves a certain way, we have to speak a certain way that is aligned with like this European way of thinking about things and seeing things. And really the way we speak, the words we use, like, try to have a thought with that isn't, in a European language, right? Like just a pure thought. Like we can't do that. We're programmed to see the world a certain way. And I don't think that was true before colonialism, right? Before the arrival of Europeans, where everything was intermingled, but there was also, it was very fluid. Like we speak about the Aztecs or, like the Mexica, but there was a worldview that allowed for other worldviews that were then become part of that worldview, right? So there was multiplicities there. And to me, that was very important. So when we talk about like criminalized aesthetics, it's the same thing, right? Like we can see something as a point of pride and like a cultural like high point, and at the same side, once it comes to like the flip side, where it comes to the legal system, it could be something that's criminalized, right? So that's a criminalized aesthetic. Like how many times were people like put on a gang database just because they're wearing a Raiders jersey or something?
I
That's a
see.
criminalized aesthetic, right?
Right.
Like that's the
Right.
same thing. Like um, it's something that I think strange now even is thinking about like, oh, like 3 or 4 young Chicanos walking on the street, like, oh, like why don't we see that more often, right? Like why would we stay at home because we would be seen as gang members, right? So it's
Right.
difficult to think about. Like, it's nice to see the you know, the younger generation now, like when you see a lot of kids together, like we couldn't do that. You know, we couldn't be out there because it was such a heavy-handed criminalization of the community of black and brown,
Yeah, the
youth.
police all of a sudden say, "Hey, that's a gang member," or they're up to no good, or "Hey, he's in the lowrider. He must be, I don't know, dealing drugs or just doing something illegal." Where it's just, "Hey, I
And where does
car."
that come from, right? Like the way we were dressed, like if we had a Pendleton on, if we were like riding in a Regal, like whatever it was, like that got pointed out and that got turned into like an aesthetic that was literally criminalized.
Yeah, yeah, and it's definitely racial because I mean, it was only it was something. I mean, it became adopted by by the African American community, and it still is. And even now, a lot of different cultures have adopted the low riding.
Mhm.
But the low riding has its origins, in East LA, and it was a form of them expressing themselves. And once the institutions or law enforcement saw that, hey, this is particular to this one community or this culture, this race, then they put these laws in the book that it's illegal for your car to be lower than whatever x
Mhm.
amount of inches. But had white people or any other, European, someone of European descent been doing the same thing, maybe it wouldn't have been as easy to criminalize it. But because it wasn't like that, then it became criminalized.
I mean, I speak specifically to the criminalized aesthetic when it comes to Chicano culture, but I think, and this is just like kind of off topic, but it fits in, is that there was, for some reason in the United States, which I haven't like studied, like there was this um, you know kind of equating youth with criminality, and so I mean, before there was I don't know, like you think of when you look at the custom car culture, like hot rodders. I mean, it was a lot of young people doing that also, and people who were really into choppers, like a lot of youth, they were all criminalized too. And so that's when we start getting into class warfare, right? Like we
Hmm.
started thinking about, well, who were these people that couldn't afford bail, or like whatever, like, or who could afford to be doing these, I don't know, something else, right? And that was the thing, is like that this custom culture, anything that differentiated you from this very individualistic nuclear family that served the corporate system, that was looked down upon. And specifically with us, it was lowrider culture, it was pachucos, zoot suiters, like all of these things. And that's the thing, is that like zoot suits came from African American culture,
Right.
right? And so it was adopted by Filipinos, by Mexicanos, by so many different people, and that was youth culture that was being criminalized at the same time. But there was a specific form of criminality with Mexicanos, right? And that has to do again with colonialism, with the Mexican American War, like an erasure of that part of that history. And so that's what I try to touch on. And so this truck was, for me, kind of working within an institution that I had, that was part of that criminality, right? Like criminalizing it and saying, you're going to help me with this. Like this institution, I'm gonna subvert it and take funding from here and put it back into this truck, which was built by not just myself, but it was collaborative because nobody could build it right by themselves. Like,
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. You're listening to Chicano Rap Radio, raw and uncut.
Chicano Rap Radio, raw and uncut.
Welcome back to Chicano Rap Radio. We've been chopping it up with Oscar Magallanes, aka NiMexica. He's been talking about his journey from a youth till now, how he got into the art, how he eventually went back to UCSD, and just recently finished his master's. His thesis was based on the criminalization of aesthetics. How you're driving a lowrider or the way you dress, certain things that you see aesthetically have been taken by the law enforcement community and turned it into something illegal. And I wanted to continue that conversation before we wrap it up, because you were mentioning something about um, getting funding from the institution for the truck that you got behind you and putting it back into the community. Explain that to me a little bit. How is it that works?
yeah, and I mean, I guess first off, I should say like anybody who really wants to go into school, like there's a way to do it, right? Like, um, you know, if you're looking for higher education, I know it's difficult, and it's even extremely difficult to do once you're in there, but it's something that's well worth it because we change the institution when we're there too. Like the conversation, if we're not there, then there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of things that are just uh, blatantly wrong, you know, that they get wrong about the community, about the culture, um, and and the conversation becomes that we don't want to be there, right? But really, it's that we're being excluded from it many times. But one of the things is that I looked for a program that was fully funded and that had also job opportunities. So I was teaching while I was there. So I worked first as a teacher's assistant, and then um, and at UCSD it's a 3-year program. So, and one of the reasons I went there also was because Ruben Ortiz Torres is there. And if you don't know who he is, look him up. Ruben Ortiz Torres has his work in institutions from, you know, Mexico up through here, and has done a lot of great work. But has done work around Chicano aesthetics, which is really interesting work. And in the lowrider community, he's worked with Salvador. I'm not gonna remember his last name right now. He's gonna kill me for this. But Chavad, like, who built Alien Toy, who actually won the Super Show back in like, I don't know, 94, 95 or something. Is like a legend when it comes to bed dancing, and he's actually helped me on this project. Um, but yeah, that was the thing, is that to be able to get something where I was going to be paying for it, where I was actually getting funding for it. And so I took advantage of that and said, I'm going to build this lowrider. From the very beginning, I had it in mind that I was going to be working on this. So funding that I was getting, I was saving, I was applying for different grants. And so that I was able to then take, and once I started building it, I was able to take the lowrider to different places or work with different individuals and pay them for their work, for their services. And these were mom and pop shops, like multi-generational, like shops with like Mexicanos, been running it for a long time, and you know, pay for those services. You know, and that money was coming from UCSD or from even work that I did while I was at UCLA. And to me, that was important, right? That's
And so you're
something
saying,
where people were being excluded, and then somehow make them part of the conversation.
right, right. And so you're saying that encouraging people to follow their dream if they want to have higher learning, but also so that we're part of the conversation, like there is this system that we may perceive as being broken, but we can't fix it if we're not there to contribute to the conversation. Is that what you're saying in regards to
I
enrolling?
I'll put it this way: it's we didn't create the problem, but we are often tasked with fixing it, right? And that's just not the way it is. Like the systemic racism, like the burden is always put on, like, oh, like, what if, you know, this is, the system tells us, well, how do we fix it? It's not our job to fix it. Like, we're not the problem. It's us being excluded is the problem, right? But on the flip side of that, if we're not in these institutions, then the conversation goes wherever it wants to, and we're not able to intercede and to give that presence and say, like, no, this is actually factually incorrect, or there's a reason why we feel unwelcome here, and that's something that you should address. And to be able to be part of that conversation is really important, because we're not and don't get me wrong, like the schools are there to condition you to think a certain way, right? But once you get into the into a master's program, it's very different. um, where it isn't so regimented. You're able to study what you want to do. You're able to do projects that you want to do, especially in an art, um, like in the context of art, like I built a lowrider. um, but that was bringing these other things that have been traditionally excluded from the conversation, from the institutions to the institution, and force them to have a conversation around it, force them to change their worldview, force them to include it in the conversation, where they've been excluded for tradition, excluded forever, pretty much. And so to me, that's what's important. Like, what can you do when you go to the institution, right? Like, you're helping the institution change as well by being present.
Hmm.
And it's just having this understanding, right? And I'm lucky that I was older when I did it. I mean, both sides, right? Like, I was very unlucky earlier on where I couldn't do it, but to me, I had a different worldview already coming into this, and I had different experiences, and I had already, just life experience. So I was able
Right.
to have the conversation about this around that.
And do you think that so because you went to UC San Diego, correct?
Yes, for my graduate studies, and I went to UCLA for my undergrad.
Okay. And do you think your thesis statement, with it being, something so powerful, you think it contributed to what you're talking about in regards to being part of the conversation and maybe changing people in the leadership level to kind of look at things different or reassess what they're doing?
Yes, it does. But I'm also not making. I mean, I wrote this thesis and it's going to go into a library and no one's ever going to read it, or like a few people might read it. But it was important to me also to think about, okay, how do we have a something that's sustainable, right? So with Ruben Ortiz Torres, I'm starting a car club, like a UC car club, right? Like
Mm,
because there's been a lot of car clubs where like imports, where people who actually have a lot of money are able to like have their nice fixed up rides, but there's never been a lowrider car club. And to me, it was how do we then continue this conversation and connect the community, like this aspect of the community, and try to promote more scholarship around it. Try to
right.
also make it accessible for other people that might be interested in the lowrider community, and say, how do you project yourself into this space? Well, let's do car shows. Let's talk about it. Let's be both in the community and also here in the institution and bring those things together. And to me, it was important to do that with the lowrider and say, okay, well, we're already talking about lowrider aesthetics. Let's actually go to the real thing and talk about car clubs and having this support group within the institution.
Yeah. And I think it's really powerful for you to be able to accomplish that, because it's also interesting how you accomplish this at UC San Diego, which is minutes from the border, which is like in the
Mhm.
predominantly, like Chicano or Latino community, so, for the institution to be able to exist for so many years without this before is really interesting. It just goes to show how isolated or how well insulated it was, from any outside influences until, you came along with your thesis and kind of change the conversation a little bit. So, I think future students and, anybody else that benefits from that program, they're going to be thankful that you started the conversation. So I think that's really powerful.
No, thank you. Yeah, and I mean, in everything we do, or at least in everything I do, I try to make sure, like, if I have an opportunity to do that, that door's not going to shut behind me, right?
Hmm.
Another member of the collective is going to go to UCSD this coming year,
Wow.
and so it's that, how do we support each other in doing these things, right? So if we
T-
have an experience that's beneficial for someone else, how do we help others go through that as well?
Tell me a little bit more about that, the 3B Collective. Why 3B, and what kind of projects you guys have coming up that, that maybe we can keep an eye on.
Yeah, 3B again came up because of uh, there were things that we couldn't there were opportunities that came up that we couldn't do on our own, right? So we worked collectively, and when we look at and going back to Chicano art, right? Like when we look at some of the most successful Chicano artists, they worked as a collective. We had the streetscapers, we had Los Four, we have traditionally, people who have worked together, and that they're able to really use all the different resources to get ahead. And to me, that was something that was important when I was, doing my undergrad, looking at these other Chicanos and Latinos to say, hey, let's come together and work on these projects. And it's gone well. Where I don't know, we've been working for almost 5 years now, and we have, I think, six big projects going on right now that have to do with public art. And so there's that conversation around murals, public art, making things accessible. And within the art world, all of a sudden, with COVID and the museums and galleries closing down, all of a sudden everybody wanted to do public art. And to us, like, now we've been on this for a minute now. Like, this is we didn't have our own galleries, we didn't have our own institutions, we didn't have our museums, so we're putting art on the streets. That's what we were doing, and
Right.
it was important for me to bring that into the conversation with institutions as well, right? Like, okay, how do we work with institutions to be able to then do something within the community or bring the community to the institution? It's always like this give and take. It's never this one-sided
Hmm.
conversation of like, okay, we're just going to bring the aesthetic, like somebody wants a graffiti mural or something, right? Like, and this is like specific to projects that come up. It's like, no, it isn't just about like borrowing this credibility from the community. It's like, how are you actually going to invest in the community? And to me,
Yeah,
that's an important conversation.
And you're contributing to the conversation. I mean, I think one of the ones that kind of just jumped into my mind right now was the mural you guys did for the Ruben Salazar
The 50th
mural.
anniversary of the
Yeah,
Chicano moratorium and the murder
which
of, yeah.
Ruben Salazar, which till this day, there's a lot of people who are like, "Who's Ruben Salazar?" You know?
Google him, like look him
Yeah.
up.
No,
Yeah.
look him up. He
No.
was the voice of the Chicano community, one of the first Chicano writers for the L.A. Times, who unfortunately was, and there's some controversy behind it, but he was killed by LAPD during one of
Yeah.
the protests. The
During the
Chicano
Chicano
moratorium.
moratorium.
Yep.
Yeah, and even if you don't know about the Chicano moratorium, like just and I'm sure your listeners, people who are watching like know about the Chicano moratorium, but look up Ruben Salazar. Like it's very important. It's tied again back to systemic racism. Like the
Hmm.
majority of people being killed in Vietnam were Chicanos and Latinos.
Yeah.
Ton of people being drafted. Even to this day, like East LA serves as a feeding ground to the military.
Right.
Um, but yeah, all of that is part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So yeah, we were very happy to be part of that. That event. That anniversary of an important event in history. And that's what we're trying to do. Is a lot of murals are being whitewashed, being erased. Gentrification has gotten rid of a lot of murals. Dispersing our community, which to me I believe has to do with breaking up political power, like voting blocks.
Hmm.
Um, and so the murals are markers, and so
Yeah.
it's important for us to put up new murals,
Yeah.
and to hopefully educate others. I mean, mentorship is a big thing, and to me it was important having
Right.
more experience, kind of being the veteran in the group, to be able to say, okay, like I have these opportunities. How do I share it with others,
Hmm.
where we could, magnify the impact.
Yeah. And I think I want to say, thank you very much for contributing to the community in that form, because I think there's a lot of people that grow up in the community that walk by murals all the time, and they might not even be aware of what the mural is saying, but at least it's there, and subconsciously it's communicating to them something powerful, and at some point it's going to spark the interest of, hey, what's this about, what are they trying to tell me, or even inspire, so a young Chicano or a young Latino to pursue their dream, and go on, and break the mold of this is who you are because you're a Chicano, because you live in this community, because you live in this poor neighborhood. This is only you can be. No, you can be anything that you want. It's just we don't have that many opportunities to rise. So I think public art is a good way to kind of start to get the conversation going, to inspire these young kids to think outside the box, and to really believe in themselves, and to be proud of who they are and where they come from. Because for me, growing up, experiencing some of this institutionalized racism from either teachers, principals, or even police officers kind of really changed my worldview, and it almost made it seem you have to fight that urge uh, to not be ashamed of who you are. Because they're initially telling you you're less than me, you can't speak Spanish, or you shouldn't speak Spanish, and it takes a strong mind to overcome that. So it's okay to be proud of your culture and your heritage, and educate yourself and elevate yourself, and rise, so we
Hmm.
can all rise together. um,
Exactly.
I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I wanted to get any last words for our listeners, anything that you want to leave us with before we end the interview.
No, just if anybody's has any questions, I'm super accessible. Just look me up, and thank you for the opportunity. I mean, it's something that's really important as far as having a conversation where we're, you know, broadening the conversation around not just Chicano rap, but Chicano art, Chicano history,
Mhm.
and even going into like this new iteration of our culture, right? Like going into Chicanx culture, like what is it when we're talking about all these things that are very important within the conversation, both in the community and in institutions, right? So I really want to thank you for taking that on. It's a lot to take on, but I'm happy to be a little part of that conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, and in the future we hope to have you back so that we can keep the conversation going. Anybody out there who hasn't already experienced some of Oscar's artwork, make sure you go check out his Instagram or go to his website. Check out the in the comment section or in the description section below. Make sure you check it out. We're gonna have links to his public profiles and his website. So in case you want to follow him and check out some of the work that he's done or he's doing or he's going to continue to do, make sure you follow him. Thank you so much for joining us once more. And you're listening to Chicano Rap Radio, raw and uncut.
Chicano Rap Radio, raw and uncut.